Hi, I'm Brad Bright, and this is the God is the Issue podcast. The problem in America today is not that there's too much darkness. The problem is there's not enough light, and that is why God is the issue in every issue. Now, today we're going to be talking about the border, compassion, and Jesus, and I'm going to be very straightforward. I'm going to talk about what's going on at the border, what it means to be compassionate on this issue, and what on earth does Jesus have to do with it. The same Jesus who said, "Blessed are the merciful, for they will see God," also said, "Be as shrewd as snakes, but as innocent as doves." In other words, compassion without wisdom is folly. Now, many open border folks accuse the build the wall folks of lacking compassion. But those who want to throw the border wide open lack wisdom. I used to support an open border. I grew up in Southern California where I observed that real people on both sides of the border benefited from having the porous border. Now, there were some downsides, of course, but since our politicians refused or were unable to really develop a viable work visa policy, it was a better option to have a porous border than to slam the doors shut. However, since then, the situation has devolved profoundly. We now know that terrorists are crossing the borders or attempting to cross the borders, at least in record numbers. Last year, we caught, 464 known or suspected terrorists trying to cross the border. This past year, as of June, we've caught over 478 known or suspected terrorists trying to cross the border. Who knows how many have slipped through? There's no way to know that. But I assume that some have. Now, many of our fellow Americans will likely die if these terrorists are successful. It's happened before. It's probably going to happen again. We also know that fentanyl is crossing our southern border and is slaughtering thousands of our fellow Americans. In 2001, 107,000 Americans died of drug overdoses. Over half of those were from fentanyl. Now, last year, the DEA seized over 379 million doses of fentanyl. Folks, this is an epidemic. Controlling the border would save more American lives than gun control ever will, and yet many of the folks who plead for greater gun regulation also demand an open border. That makes no sense to me whatsoever. We also know that sex traffickers are smuggling helpless girls across the border, turning them into sex slaves. Sex trafficking is also becoming an epidemic. We know that the cartels are not only invading the U.S., but they are destroying the lives of countless Mexican citizens on the other side of the border as well. How can a thinking person turn a blind eye to such tragedies and then claim in any sort of credible way to be compassionate? Folks, that's not compassion. That's virtue signaling. They may have good intentions, but they are still destroying real people and real people's lives. Good intentions without wisdom kills people. Did you catch that? Good intentions without wisdom kills people. They are inadvertently, at least I hope inadvertently, aiding and abetting sex trafficking, drug dealers, and terrorists. That, they feel for the illegal aliens, and I honestly believe that they feel compassion for them. But at the same time, they're hardening their hearts to the carnage that their compassion is causing for their neighbors. Folks, selective compassion is not compassion. Jesus said, "Love your neighbor as yourself." That's often hard to do in the real world, I know. But if you heartlessly condemn one neighbor in the name of helping the other neighbor, do you really think Jesus would call that compassion? I know now many of you are thinking, "Brad, we have to help the folks who are so desperate that they risk everything to come to America in hopes of bettering their lives and the lives of the people they love, especially their children." And I completely agree with you. I agree with what your heart is telling you. But here is the critical question. How do we do both? How do we help the immigrants and the girls who are being hurt from sex trafficking and the people, the Americans who are dying of fentanyl, and keep the border closed to potential terrorists? I think my answer may surprise many of you, but it will not surprise my brothers and sisters south of the border who live in Latin America. I learned from them There's only one way to solve both problems. It won't be easy, it won't be quick, but it is the only real solution. It's the only solution that deals with the underlying cause. But first, in order to protect our fellow Americans, yes, we must close the border. We must shut down the sex trafficking coming across the border. We must shut down the fentanyl coming across the border. And we must shut down the border to any potential terrorists trying to get across. And simultaneously, we must change our immigration policies. Now, folks, that's the easy part. Let's talk about the hard part now. That is how to help those who are south of the border who currently see America as their only hope. Let me ask you a question. If the immigrants who are risking their lives to come to America felt that they could stay at home and be able to provide for the welfare and safety of their families, do you think they'd try to come here, or do you think they'd stay home? I think they'd stay home. I know I would. So how do we make that possible? Have you ever seriously asked that question? Now, the answer is simple, but it'll require a lot of people like you and like me to engage. In fact, it'll require tens of thousands of people like you and me to engage. You see, the United States government is completely incapable of solving the underlying problem. Now, the U.S. can do some things to suppress the symptoms for a while, but it is incapable, that is, the government is incapable of solving the underlying problem. Now, in order to solve the underlying problem, we must first understand what the underlying problem is. Do you have any idea what the underlying problem is? Is it poverty? Is it corruption? Is it lack of education? Now, all those are problems, I agree, but are one of those the underlying problem? Now, if you don't know what the underlying problem is, how are you going to solve it? See, every culture has a dark side, including ours. So understand, as we talk here today, I'm not picking on Latin America. What I want to do is I want to talk about the dark side of Latin culture so we can better understand what the solution is. Now, in Spanish, there is a word that sums up the primary symptom of the problem. Not the problem itself, but the primary symptom of the problem. And that word is morbida. I learned this word while living in Mexico, and morbida simply means bribe. Morbida means the bribe. The morbida is a cultural addiction throughout all of Latin America. Almost every government project, almost every business deal, almost every traffic stop involves morbida. I remember when I was in my 20s, I decided to go down to Baja California for the weekend with some friends, and we hopped in the car. We rented a place on the beach, and one evening we decided we wanted to go down to a restaurant. It was about 30 minutes down the coast. So we went there, had a great time, and on the way driving back, it was probably 9:30 at night. We were pulled over by the federales. They made all of us get out of the car, and they started looking through the car, kind of going, looking for stuff like they were looking for drugs. Now, then we kind of looked at each other and said, we don't want to take the chance of spending the night in the Mexican jail, so what do we need to do? So we offered the federales some cash. They took it, smiled, and they drove off. See, folks, that's the morbida. I remember when I was living in Mexico, a friend of mine who was an American missionary to Mexico, he was a total towhead. I mean, he was blonde as blonde can be, so he stuck out in a culture of mostly dark-haired, brown-skinned people. And he had, at this one intersection in Cuernavaca, he had been pulled over numerous times for running a red light. And finally, he kind of got a little frustrated and realized there was something going on here. And so one day he went down and inspected that intersection. He realized the lights were rigged to make it look like you had run a red light. And so having done that, he went and looked up some of the traffic regulations down at City Hall. So the next time he was pulled over, he said to the officer, he said, "Officer, let me show you. The lights, the timing of the lights are off." And he showed him, and he said, "And here are the laws, the regulations that really deal with this issue." And finally, the officer looked at him and said, "Sir, I'm so sorry. All I wanted was money for a Coke." You see, folks, that's morbida. And it goes from the top of the culture to the bottom. And I remember flying to the Philippines one day, and understand the Philippines was a Spanish colony for 300 years. And so culturally, it's very similar to much of Latin America. And so as I was flying over there, I was seated next to this gentleman, and we began chatting. And as we chatted, he said, "You know, my brother was the former Secretary of the Treasury in the Philippines." And he said a number of years ago, the U.S. gave the money to build a state-of-the-art steel mill. To this day, the steel mill has never been built, and no one knows what has ever happened to the money. He said, you know what our problem in the Philippines is? It's not that we don't have enough money. It's that we're a nation of cheaters. And because of that, we can't build capital and build things that can employ our people. Frankly, I was almost shocked at his blunt honesty, that he as a Filipino would say, our national problem is we're a nation of cheaters. You see, welcoming illegal immigrants from Latin America will never change the morbida embedded in their souls. It does not correct the fundamental problem in Latin America driving illegal immigration to the U.S. Real compassion demands we address the underlying cancer that affects both Hispanics who try to come to America and those who cannot. Over the years, I have conversed with many of my Christian brothers and sisters throughout Central America. They all agree that neither capitalism nor socialism can ever solve the economic problems they face. You know why? Because the real problem is not economic. The problem is embedded in their souls like a cancer. Morbida is fundamentally a spiritual problem. Therefore, the solution must be a spiritual solution. Until then, no economic plan will ever work, and illegal immigration will remain a problem, wall or no wall. See, we can suppress the flow of immigration across the border for a while, but Latin America is a powder keg. Mexico is a powder keg. Sooner or later, it is going to blow, and we will not be immune from the consequences. It will explode across the border. I'm reminded of William Wilberforce, who is a British parliamentarian in the early 1800s. He's credited with overturning the slave trade throughout the British Empire. We all owe him a great debt of gratitude. However, it is absolutely critical to understand what happened in Britain prior to William Wilberforce that allowed him to be successful. It was the preaching of John Wesley. Because of John Wesley, many average Britons became devout followers of Jesus. And because of their faith, many of them became abolitionists. And these folks ultimately set the foundation for Wilberforce's success. Without Wesley, you could not have had a Wilberforce. Likewise in America, without the preaching of men like George Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards, and many others, the abolitionist movement would have been stillborn. Abraham Lincoln or not, we would still probably embrace slavery today. It was the gospel of Jesus Christ that drove social transformation. Spiritual transformation always precedes positive cultural transformation. Did you catch that? Spiritual transformation always precedes positive cultural transformation. So anyone who's serious about helping our Hispanic brothers and sisters should be serious about reaching the Latins with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I'm talking about more than just salvation. I'm talking about teaching them who God is and why it matters. I'm talking about what it looks like to follow Jesus, where we're accountable to God and responsible for our fellow neighbor, where we care for the widows, the orphans, and the poor. That's what John Wesley did, and it changed Britain for 100 years. God really is the issue when it comes to illegal immigration. Now, if we do not help the average person in Latin America better understand who God really is and why it matters, all we can do is either build a wall to suppress the symptoms or be overrun. And if we're overrun, they will infect us with their morbida. It will no longer just be the powerful in America who take bribes. It will be the traffic cop. It will be the school administrator. It will be the prison guard. It will be the construction foreman who builds your home. It will be the judge hearing your case. Is that what you want? You see, real compassion values the sex slave, the fentanyl addict, the victims of terrorism, and the illegal immigrant. Without the gospel, we must choose who to help and who to condemn. In other words, we have to play God Is that what you really want? But with the gospel of Jesus Christ, we can help them all. See, the problem in Latin America is not that there's too much darkness. The problem is there's not enough light. So the next time the border issue comes on, ask yourself how you can make a difference. Will you go to Latin America on a short-term outreach? Will you consider going as part of a long-term mission? Will you help support a Christian missionary in Latin America, either an American or a national? Find an orphanage to support, and then go down there and visit. Meet the people, get to know them. Go to your church and see if they have any outreach programs to Latin America. The options are almost limitless. You can't do everything, but you can do something. And ask God what he wants you to do. Because I assure you, God cares much more deeply than you do. You see, God really is the issue in every issue. Folks, thanks for joining us today. I know this was a bit of a heavy podcast, but if it has been meaningful to you or helpful to you, please subscribe and then share it with someone else who needs to hear it. And again, let me strongly encourage you. You can't do everything, but you can do something. Ask God what he would have you to do.